My name is James Carter. At 41, I was a man carved from routine and hardened by over a decade of service as a corrections officer. Most of that time was spent pacing the cold concrete floors of Northwood Maximum Security, a place that exists as a monument to human failure. Northwood isn't a facility you see in slick documentaries about criminal justice reform. It's a sprawling, concrete beast, a city of gray walls and perpetual twilight, crowned with glittering razor wire that snags the sun. It holds the worst of the worst, men whose crimes are the stuff of nightmares, whose rap sheets read like horror novels. Here, the air itself feels heavy, saturated with the residue of violence, despair, and a suffocating primal rage. In a place like Northwood, respect isn't given, it's a currency earned in blood and fear. It's taken, day by day, in 1,000 tiny battles of will. Every shift is a 16-hour test of nerve, of character, of your ability to project an aura of unshakable authority while your insides are screaming. The mechanics of the job are deceptively simple. You count heads, you open doors, you lock doors, you watch. But the execution of these simple tasks is an art form, and the stage is unforgiving. You learn to read the atmosphere like a sailor reads the sky. You feel the subtle shifts in pressure, the drop in temperature that signals a coming storm. You learn to differentiate between the everyday noise of prison life and the specific, targeted silence that precedes an explosion. My record was spotless, a testament to my rigid self-discipline. My uniform was always crisp, my boots shined to a mirror finish, and my posture ramrod straight. I lived by the book, not just because it was the rules, but because I believed in it. My philosophy was simple, and I applied it without exception: firm, fair, and consistent. I treated the inmates like men, because they were, but I never for a second let them, or myself, forget where we were. You don't make friends inside. You are an officer, a symbol of order in a world perpetually on the brink of chaos. The moment you forget that, the moment you let the line blur, is the moment you lose control, your authority, and maybe your life. Before the trouble, my reputation on the block was solid. I had a history. Inmates knew I wouldn't bend the rules for anyone, but they also knew I wouldn't break them either. I remember a young inmate, barely 20, named Kevin, who was terrified, constantly being preyed on by older predators. One afternoon, I saw him being cornered in the laundry. I didn't shout or draw my baton. I just walked over, my presence a silent question. I stared down the 3 men cornering him and said, "Laundry duty's over. Time to clear out." They postured, sized me up, and saw no fear in my eyes. They saw no anger. They only saw a man who would not be moved. They left. I never spoke to Kevin about it, and he never spoke to me, but after that day, he walked a little taller, and the predators found easier prey. That was my way. Firm, fair, consistent. The trouble, when it finally came, didn't start with a riot, a shanking in the yard, or a cell fire. It started with a sound. A single quiet note of amusement, so subtle it was almost lost in the din of the morning routine. It was a laugh, and it came from a man named Rico, the undisputed shot caller for the Soldados, the largest and most ruthless gang in Northwood. Rico wasn't the biggest man on the block. He was far from it. He was wiry, compact, and moved with a predatory stillness that was far more unnerving than any amount of brute muscle. He had a way of observing the world from behind his dark, intelligent eyes that made you feel like you were a specimen under a microscope. He didn't need to raise his voice. His power was absolute, radiating from him in an invisible, suffocating aura. His quietest whisper could command more obedience than a warden's bullhorn. He demanded fear and respect in equal measure, and he always got what he demanded. My day had begun like any other. The 5 a.m. alarm, the bitter coffee, the drive to the prison under a bruised, pre-dawn sky. Then came the familiar rituals: morning count, the clatter and clang of breakfast trays, followed by the meticulous cell inspections on C block. But that week, a subtle dissonance had crept into the symphony of prison life. Every time I walked my route on the upper tier, a ghost of a sound would follow me. As I passed Rico's cell, that same quiet laugh would prick the back of my neck. It was a soft, breathy chuckle that never outlasted my footsteps but lingered in the air long after I'd passed. The first day, I dismissed it. The second, I noted it. The third, I understood it. The next day, it metastasized. As I passed Rico's cell, the laugh was there, and then, from the next cell over, one of his lieutenants, a mountain of a man named Hector, echoed it. Then another, from across the tier. It wasn't loud, but it was coordinated. It was a message. A day later, it had evolved into a low, rumbling chorus of snickers and whispers that rippled down the entire cell block every time I made my rounds. They were testing me. It was a classic prison power play, a psychological siege designed to chip away at the very foundation of my authority. In here, perception is reality. If the inmates see you as weak, if they believe they can rattle you, you become prey. It's as simple and as brutal as that. The other officers noticed. It was impossible not to. A few of the older guys, men like me who understood the intricate language of the block, gave me supportive nods. It was a silent acknowledgment of the game being played, a gesture that said, "We see you, hold the line." Others, mostly the younger, more timid officers who just wanted to get through their shift without incident, advised me to let it slide. "It's just inmates being inmates, Carter," one of them, a fresh-faced kid named Miller, told me in the break room. "They're bored. Let it go. It's all part of the game. Don't give them the satisfaction." But my gut, an organ I'd learned to trust more than my own eyes, screamed that this was different. This wasn't random, unfocused defiance. This was a coordinated, deliberate campaign, orchestrated with chilling precision. This was Rico, and Rico did nothing without a purpose. He was sending a message not just to me, but to everyone on the block, inmates and officers alike. I decided to take it up the chain of command, to follow the protocol I had built my career on. I requested a meeting with the warden, a man named Thompson who had masterfully cultivated a public image as a progressive reformer. His office was on the administrative side of the prison, a world away from the grit and grime of the cell blocks. He sat behind a giant polished mahogany desk that seemed too large for the room, a throne for a king in a tailored suit. The walls behind him were a gallery of his own success, covered in framed photographs of him shaking hands with smiling politicians and beaming community leaders. He listened with a practiced, patient look on his face, his head tilted slightly as if weighing every word. I laid it all out, the genesis of the mockery, the calculated escalation, the chillingly coordinated nature of it, and the palpable shift in the atmosphere on C Block. I explained that it wasn't about hurt feelings. It was about the strategic erosion of an officer's authority, which put everyone at risk. When I finished, he leaned back in his leather chair and steepled his fingers, a portrait of thoughtful leadership. "It's just chatter, Carter," he said finally, his voice smooth and placating. He waved a dismissive hand, as if swatting away a fly. "Rico's just blowing off steam. These guys are animals in a cage, and sometimes they have to roar a little. They're testing you, that's all. Let it go." He leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "The block is quiet, James. My numbers are good. We haven't had a major incident in C Block in over a year. Don't go kicking the hornet's nest over a few laughs." His answer was a punch to the gut. It felt profoundly, fundamentally wrong. It wasn't just that he was dismissing my professional concerns. He was ordering me to stand down, to actively permit the dismantlement of my own authority. It became chillingly clear in that moment that Warden Thompson cared more about the prison looking peaceful on paper than about the actual safety and command of his own officers. The good numbers and the smiling photos on the wall were more important than the men who ensured them. I left his office with a pit of cold dread in my stomach. The warden wasn't going to back me up. I was on my own. As Thompson had ordered, I let it go. And, as I had predicted, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The whispers turned into barely veiled insults, spoken just loud enough for me to hear. The laughter grew louder, more brazen, tinged with a new note of contempt. The final straw came during rec time in the main yard, a vast concrete expanse surrounded by towering fences. I was posted near the basketball courts, my eyes scanning the controlled chaos of 200 inmates blowing off steam. One of Rico's guys, a big, hulking bruiser named Torres, was walking past with his lunch tray. He was known for his hair-trigger temper and brute strength. He made a great show of, accidentally, tripping on a perfectly flat piece of concrete right in front of me. The tray flew from his hands in a perfect arc, and a sloppy pile of mashed potatoes and greasy brown gravy slid across the ground, splattering all over my freshly polished boots. A split second of silence, and then the entire yard erupted. It wasn't just snickering anymore. It was a wave of open, howling laughter. It was flagrant, it was public, and it was utterly, profoundly humiliating. It was a direct challenge, thrown down in front of 100 inmates and a half-dozen other officers. I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't let it go. My hand was forced. I looked from my gravy-covered boots to Torres's smirking face, then to the sea of laughing inmates. In that instant, I decided. I had to face Rico head-on, no matter the consequences. The game had to end. The next day, I planned my move with tactical precision. I chose my moment carefully, the midday count. The count is a sacred procedure in any prison, a time when the entire facility holds its breath. Inmates are brought out of their cells, lined up on the tiers, and every single man is accounted for. It's a strictly regimented process where silence and order are paramount, and tensions always run high. A single disruption can have catastrophic consequences. As if fate itself were setting the stage, Warden Thompson was on the tier that day. He was making a rare and highly visible appearance, likely for the benefit of some visiting official he was trying to impress. His presence, standing there in his immaculate suit, raised the stakes to an impossible height. This was it. This was my chance to reassert my authority, to draw a line in the sand and show both the inmates and my own warden that I was not going to break. I began my walk down the line, my footsteps echoing in the tense, humming silence. The air was thick enough to taste. Each inmate I passed met my eyes for a fraction of a second before looking away, their faces blank masks. I continued down the long tier of C-block until I stopped directly in front of Rico. He was leaning against the railing with a lazy, arrogant smirk plastered on his face, the very picture of a man who owned the world he stood in. The moment I stopped, his entire crew visibly tensed, their bodies coiling like springs, ready to uncoil into violence at a word from their leader. "You find something funny, Rico?" I asked. I kept my voice low, steady, and deliberately devoid of emotion. I pitched it to carry no further than the few feet between us, a private conversation in a very public space. I was projecting a calm I did not feel. My heart was a hammer against my ribs. He slowly, theatrically, pushed himself off the railing. He moved with a liquid grace, closing the distance between us and deliberately invading my personal space. He was shorter than me, but he had a way of looking up at you that felt like he was looking down, his gaze boring into you. "Maybe, officer," he said. his voice a syrupy, fake whisper of respect that was more insulting than any shout. "Maybe we're just enjoying the beautiful day inside this fine institution. Is that against the rules?" Behind him, a few of his followers let out low, appreciative chuckles. "Disrespecting an officer is," I shot back, holding his stare, refusing to be the first to break eye contact. The seconds stretched into an eternity. "The games are over. Whatever this is, it stops now." He let out a short, sharp laugh, a bark of genuine amusement this time. The sound was like a rock thrown into a still pond, sending ripples of tension through the assembled inmates. "Or what, Carter?" he sneered, dropping all pretense of respect. "You gonna write me up? Send me to the SHU for a week?" He took another half-step forward. I could feel the warmth of his breath, smell the cheap, state-issue soap on his clothes. His fists were clenched into tight, white-knuckled knots at his sides, the tattoos across them warped and distorted. The entire block was holding its breath. A fight here, an officer against an inmate leader during a standing count, would trigger an instant lockdown. It could easily spiral into a full-blown riot. But if I backed down now, in front of everyone, inmates, officers, and the warden himself, my career was over. My life in this prison would become a living hell. My training, drilled into me over thousands of hours, kicked in. My hand instinctively moved toward the radio on my belt, but I stopped myself. Calling for backup now would be an admission of defeat, a signal of weakness. I had to handle this. My gaze flickered past Rico's shoulder, my eyes searching for and locking with Warden Thompson's. He was standing just a few yards away, watching the entire drama unfold, a spectator at his own coliseum. I made direct eye contact with him, a clear, unambiguous signal for support. It was a plea for him to step in, to use his authority, to show a united front. It's the first thing they drill into you at the academy. Staff stands together, always. Your partner, your sergeant, your warden, they have your back. Thompson did nothing. He didn't move a muscle. He didn't say a word. He didn't even blink. His mouth was slightly agape, his face ashen, his eyes wide with an expression I couldn't initially decipher. It wasn't the look of a commander assessing a tactical situation. It was the terrified look of a man who'd been caught, a man whose carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down around him. He just stood there, frozen. In that heart-stopping, split second of an action, Rico saw it, too. He followed my desperate gaze to the warden, and a flicker of brilliant, blinding understanding crossed his face. The challenging smirk on his lips melted away, replaced by a slow, full-blown, triumphant grin. He hadn't just won a standoff with a single, stubborn corrections officer. He had just won something much, much bigger. The warden's paralysis was his ultimate victory. The tension on the block didn't just break, it evaporated into thin air. Rico took a slow, theatrical step back, raising his hands in a gesture of fake surrender. He gave me a final, knowing look, a look of pity and utter contempt, and then strolled back to his spot in the line as if nothing had happened. His crew visibly relaxed, their faces smug and victorious. The message had been sent, loud and clear, to every single person in C Block, inmate and officer alike. Carter has no backup. His own warden just threw him to the wolves. Every inmate on that block had seen it happen. I was utterly, completely alone, and my authority had just been publicly executed. The rest of the shift was a surreal, out-of-body experience. The inmates stopped mocking me, but what replaced it was far worse. They didn't have to test me anymore. They had their answer. Now, they just looked right through me, as if I were a ghost, a piece of furniture, an irrelevant object in their world. It was a chilling, profound erasure of my presence, more effective and more humiliating than any insult. When my shift finally crawled to its agonizing end, I couldn't face the locker room. I couldn't bear the mixture of pity and contempt I was sure to find in the other officers' eyes. As I was heading through the staff parking lot, the sky bleeding into a bruised purple, a hand grabbed my arm, and I flinched, my body still thrumming with adrenaline. It was Dave Jensen, an old-timer, a cynical but decent vet just a few years from retirement. His face was a roadmap of weary resignation. "Let's take a walk, Carter," he said, his voice low and gravelly. We walked to the far edge of the parking lot, away from the security cameras and prying ears. The prison's guard towers cast long, skeletal shadows in the setting sun. "You really don't get it, do you?" he said, not unkindly. He lit a cigarette and took a long, deep drag, the tip glowing like a hot coal in the twilight. "You think this was about you and Rico. It wasn't. You were just a piece on the board, a pawn they had to sacrifice." Over the next hour, as darkness fully enveloped the prison, Dave laid it all out. He painted a grim, detailed picture of the dirty, rotten secret of Northwood. Warden Thompson's entire career, his polished reputation as a reformer, his good numbers, were all built on one thing: keeping violent incidents low. And he achieved his stellar safety record by making a deal with the devil. "Thompson lets Rico run his rackets inside," Dave explained, his voice a low growl of disgust. "He kicked at a loose piece of gravel. Contraband, gambling, protection. You name it, the soldados control it. In exchange, Rico keeps the other gangs in line. He's the one who stops the stabbings, the race wars, the big blow-ups that attract attention from the state and make the news." He took another drag from his cigarette. "Rico is the real warden of C Block. Thompson just holds the title and cashes the checks." The mocking, Dave said, had been a test, but it wasn't just Rico's. It was a test sanctioned by the warden himself. Thompson needed to know if I was the kind of officer who would play along, who would look the other way to keep the so-called peace. He needed to know if I could be managed. When I refused to ignore the disrespect, when I pushed back, and finally, when I confronted Rico, I didn't just challenge an inmate. I threatened the entire corrupt, symbiotic system that Thompson had built his career on. "When you stood up to Rico in front of him, you backed Thompson into a corner," Dave went on, his face grim in the faint glow of the parking lot lights. "If he backed you, he'd be breaking his deal with Rico. Rico would lose face, and to get it back, he'd let the block explode into violence just to prove a point. Thompson's numbers would go to hell, his career would be over, and all those photos with politicians would end up in the trash." He flicked his cigarette away, a tiny arc of orange against the blacktop. "So he did the only thing a self-serving coward could do. He let you fall. He had to show Rico, and everyone else, who he was really allied with." Suddenly, everything clicked into place with a sickening clarity. The warden brushing off my concerns as chatter, his bizarre inaction during the confrontation, that look of pure, triumphant understanding on Rico's face. I wasn't an officer being tested by inmates. I was a pawn in a high-stakes game between the warden and the prison's most powerful criminal. My strict, by-the-book approach didn't make me a good officer. It made me a liability to both of them. My life inside that prison was now in real, immediate danger, not just from the inmates who saw me as a powerless target, but from the very man who was supposed to be my commander. I felt a wave of nausea, followed by a surge of cold, burning rage. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Dave looked at me, his weary eyes holding mine. "There is no we, Carter. I'm 3 years from my pension. I keep my head down. You can't go back in there. Not like this. They'll either set you up or let you get taken out." He paused, then sighed. But if a man wanted to fight back, he wouldn't do it in there. He'd do it from the outside. With paper. Lots and lots of paper. In that moment, a new, dangerous resolve hardened inside me. I couldn't just walk away and let them win. With Dave's quiet, reluctant help over the next 2 weeks, I began to dig. Our alliance was born in that dark parking lot, a partnership forged in shared disgust. I called in sick, using up my accrued leave. My apartment became a war room. The paranoia was constant. Every car that slowed down on my street, every unfamiliar click on the phone line, sent a jolt of fear through me. Dave became my handler, my source on the inside. He'd been watching the cracks in the system for years, making mental notes, waiting for a day he never thought would come. Now, he pointed me toward them. Our first target was the duty logs. Dave smuggled out copies from the last 6 months. 4 days, I sat at my kitchen table, fueled by coffee and rage, cross-referencing rosters and incident reports. It was painstaking work. Then, I found it, a pattern. On certain nights, always between 2 and 4 a.m., experienced guards were being deliberately pulled from C-Block's key entry points and reassigned to low-priority posts on the other side of the facility. These reassignments always coincided with nights when the prison's own surveillance cameras in those sectors would mysteriously malfunction. These were the windows for contraband shipments. It was circumstantial, but it was a start. Next, Dave put me in touch with 2 other officers, older guys like him, who were fed up but too scared to speak up. I met them separately, in anonymous diners miles from the prison. I saw the fear in their eyes, the fear of losing their jobs, their pensions, their safety. I didn't pressure them. I just laid out what I had and what I believed was happening. I told them their statements could be anonymous. It took a week, but they both delivered. They provided handwritten, signed statements detailing instances where they were told to stand down during suspicious activity and confirming the pattern of guard rotation on specific nights. The final piece of the puzzle was the evidence locker. This was the most dangerous part. Dave learned that a new, inexperienced officer was managing the intake logs. Posing as an auditor from the central office, a monumental risk, Dave managed to get a look at the inventory records for a few crucial hours. He photographed pages with his phone, his hands shaking. The records showed high-value contraband, shipments of drugs and phones seized from other blocks that had been logged into evidence and then had simply vanished before they could be incinerated. They were being recycled, put back into circulation through Rico's network. It wasn't a mountain of proof, but it was a solid, damning hill. It was a clear narrative of corruption, neglect, and collusion. I spent 2 sleepless nights compiling everything into a detailed, cross-referenced report. I made 4 copies. 1 for me. 1 for Dave, as insurance. 1 I sent by courier, anonymously, to the State's Department of Corrections, addressed to the head of Internal Affairs. The last one I hand-delivered to the home of an investigative reporter I knew from a story she'd done on the prison system a few years prior. I put in my resignation the very next day, citing only personal reasons and refusing an exit interview. The silence from the administration was deafening, a confirmation of their panic. For 2 months, I lived in a state of anxious limbo. I found a job in private security, the work mundane and hollow compared to what I'd left behind. Then, one Sunday morning, it broke. My phone buzzed with a text from Dave. It just said, "Front page." I rushed out to a newsstand and saw it. The headline was splayed across the top of the paper in huge, bold letters. "Corruption at Northwood. Warden accused of colluding with gang leaders to falsify safety records." The story was an explosion. Thompson was immediately suspended. The state, forced into the spotlight, launched a full-scale, aggressive investigation that tore the lid off the whole rotten system. They found everything I had, and with their subpoena power, they found much, much more: bank records, phone logs, a whole network of rot that went even deeper than I had imagined. I never set foot inside a prison again. I lost a career that, for all its immense flaws and dangers, I had truly believed in. I believed in the idea of order, of consequence, of holding a line against the chaos. But in the end, I did more to protect my fellow officers from the outside than I ever could have from within. My revenge wasn't about fists or a show of force in the yard. It was about facts, meticulously gathered and strategically deployed. I didn't beat Rico in a fight. I tore down the corrupt structure that gave him his power. I learned that true justice isn't always something you find in a courtroom or at the end of a baton. Sometimes, it's about exposing a truth so toxic it has to be destroyed. The system I had sworn to uphold was broken, and sometimes the only way to fix something that's broken is to shatter it completely.